The lengthy, drafty hallway at Royal Lodge is draped with the weight of history, which has the power to make anyone feel incredibly small. It's a location where footsteps are supposed to be heard rather than heard, and the air itself has a subtle, lingering smell of beeswax and something older that speaks of privilege and the passing of time. A woman stood in the middle of the corridor with her hands in the middle of what could have been any winter, any typical day in a year that felt a lot like any other. Curled so tightly around a silver tray that her knuckles had become as colorless and bloodless as the marble under her feet, she had been trained to be invisible, taught from day one that the ideal servant was to function as nothing more than a ghost, effective, silent, and completely unremarkable, a presence that should hardly be noticed by anybody. However, the invisibility she had worked so hard to develop was taken away in that one instant, and she was instantly keenly conscious of her own frailty. She was a lady whose physique betrayed the anxiety and confusion that had taken hold of her. Her hands were trembling. Additionally, the man who was 3 feet away from her was making sure she felt very insignificant. During that exchange, Prince Andrew remained silent. He didn't have to, because someone who has spent 60 years being told that his every wish carries the weight of the law, that his desires are vital, and that the universe exists to fulfill his tastes, exudes a certain type of coldness. As if making direct eye contact with her would somehow reduce him, he stood there with his stance straight and his gaze locked on a spot just above her shoulder rather than on her face. He was talking about something unimportant, maybe the cushions, maybe the curtains, maybe the arrangement of a room. However, the tone in which he spoke was considerably more important than what he was actually saying. That razor-sharp, jagged edge of absolute entitlement that said her entire existence was an annoyance he had to put up with. With the accuracy of someone used to being obeyed, he said, then turned and left without waiting for an answer, his heels thudding loudly on the wood that reverberated throughout the hallways. The woman stood there still holding onto the tray. She started crying as the hush descended upon her once more. It was a more subdued and profound sound, a rhythmic drainage of her soul, the sound of someone coming to a dreadful realization, rather than the loud, jagged wailing of a public breakdown. In that instant, she had come to the realization that the person she worked for did not regard her as a human being at all, but rather as a piece of furniture to be used and then forgotten. But something changed inside of her as those tears ran down her cheeks. She glanced down at the cooling tea in the pot, then at the prince's study's closed door, and finally at the terror that still held her. A fresh, crystal-clear clarity started to emerge. Her boss would never comprehend what she did. He was clearly visible to her, yet she was invisible to him. She had witnessed his outbursts, his compulsive demands regarding the placement of his teddy bears, and the bizarre rituals he had to be carried out precisely. She had seen the secrets gather like dust in the corners of rooms. The private discussions were intended to be private. The way he acted when he thought no one important was looking, because he had persuaded himself that the individuals inside these barriers were not entirely real, he felt secure. That they lacked interiority, dignity, and memory. In this regard, he was gravely mistaken. To comprehend how a man may find himself reprimanding a staff member in the hallway of his own house over something as insignificant as a missing object or an untidy room, one must first comprehend the universe of Royal Lodge and its current state. It was a well-kept haven for a man who had gradually witnessed the rest of the world turn its back on him with an evident finality. It was a mansion of high fences and long memories. The headlines were already making the rounds. In halls much smaller than the one where this incident occurred, the names of senior colleagues were being muttered in tones ranging from scandalized to quietly knowing. There was increasing pressure from every angle. He had never seen the intensity of the public microscope trained on him before. Prince Andrew had turned into a very controversial character in the outside world. His reputation was gradually deteriorating, and it was getting harder to overlook his prior affiliations and choices. But inside Royal Lodge, behind those towering hedges and those old stone walls, he continued to pretend that he was still a prince, the ruler of his realm, who was still able to demand complete submission from everyone in his home. The teddy bears were useful in this situation. Every night, he had to arrange those 72 plush figures on his bed in a certain unbreakable hierarchy. This could have appeared to outsiders as a harmless eccentricity of an elderly man. However, those bears were delicate instruments that reflected his moods with terrible accuracy, serving as barometers of his emotional status for the people who served him. If a bear were an If the layout differed in any way from his stringent requirements, it wasn't just an error. He saw it as a betrayal, a failure so severe that it may lead to days of icy indignation and scathing comments. The woman in the corridor has been negotiating these perilous emotional terrain for years. She was aware of the floors that creaked under her weight. She was aware of his exact preference for water that was just the right temperature. Additionally, she had created an nearly miraculous capacity to foresee his demands before he expressed them. She had given up her personal time, her family time, and the everyday joys that others took for granted. All of this was done to make sure the prince's world stayed just the way he wanted it. She had been steadfastly and deeply devoted, perhaps not out of true love but rather out of a strong sense of obligation that permeates everyone who serves the crown like a thread through fabric. In a household like that, you don't just accept a job. You make an unspoken commitment to keep the house's secrets, safeguard your employer's privacy, and serve as the unseen pillar of support for them. The mansion was still, and the mist clung to the vast park that encircled Royal Lodge on the morning of the hallway incident, just like any other morning. With her customary dexterity, she had made her way around the rooms, polishing silver, straightening frames, and making sure everything was in its right place. However, there was a sense of unease in the air, a tangible electricity that suggested something was wrong or going to go wrong. The prince had been agitated, more agitated than normal. Behind closed doors, people were making phone calls and having hurried, low-pitched chats. There were attorneys coming and going, their faces now aggressively grim instead of just severe. A pattern emerged, the pattern of a guy seeing the shrinkage of his universe, the tendency of an individual whose impact was decreasing in ways that were unmanageable and irreversible. A powerful man who is used to having his desires interpreted as orders frequently tightens his hold on the world inside his walls with frightening force when he believes that his control over the outside world is eroding. Something so insignificant that, if it weren't also so vicious, the altercation would have been nearly comical. A misplaced object, a door that was slightly off, ajar, or maybe a room that wasn't set up exactly how he wanted it. He had discovered her in the corridor and dumped a week's worth of pent-up anger and anxiety on her shoulders. He had addressed her as if she were a kid, unfit to be trusted with simple chores, then as if she were an animal that was incapable of following his commands, and lastly as if she were nothing at all, a living emptiness that recorded his voice without understanding it. When he eventually turned and left, she was left standing there crying and feeling. With shaking hands and her refreshing drink, he had probably forgotten about her in less than 30 seconds. He had entered his study, taken a seat at his desk, and carried on with his life as if the incident had never occurred. He was unable to fathom what had happened in that corridor or the fact that he had violated a fundamental aspect of the structure of his own universe. He had betrayed the Invisible's allegiance, the unwritten contract that kept his family running smoothly, the unwritten agreement that protected his secrets. Inside those walls, such a moment's aftermath doesn't happen all at once. It is a gradual degradation, a slow burn, and a process that only gradually picks up speed. She initially returned to the kitchens. She dabbed at her eyes. When her co-workers saw her, they didn't question her since they didn't need to. Everybody has experienced that chill at some point. They all had to live with the knowledge that their jobs came with a price. They had to endure treatment that would never be accepted anyplace else in order to maintain their dignity. However, the price had ultimately grown too high for this woman and the guy carrying the tray in that hallway. It had shifted from a reasonable expense to an intolerable burden. She started to see things differently over the course of the following few days, as if her role's spell had been broken and she could now see plainly. She saw the prince's communication style with his family, the gaps and contradictions in his accounts, the papers that were haphazardly placed on tables. Guests who arrived in the evening and departed once more in the dark. She didn't have aspirations of tabloid fame or lucrative interviews, nor was she searching for a pay check. In that corridor, he had attempted to rob her of her humanity, and she was searching for a means of regaining the dignity that had been taken from her. She started talking, but not to the media or the scandal-hungry tabloids at first. She addressed people who had already started the arduous process of exposing and investigation in search of the truth. She supplied the minor home details that add together to create a more comprehensive and damning image. She talked about the mood of the house, the man's temperament, how he behaved when he thought no one important was around, the rituals he insisted on, and the discrepancies between his private and public lives. those who are born into luxury and power frequently make this disastrous error. They believe that those who work for them are incapable of independent thought or agency and are only components of the structure's architecture, fixtures, and fittings. They think that a person who is silent is likewise blind and deaf, unable to see or comprehend what is going on around them. However, everything had been witnessed by the woman in the corridor. She was more familiar with his life's structure than he was. She was aware of his weaknesses, phobias, and patterns, as well as the pressure points that may be triggered to expose him. When the time came for the world to demand answers from the prince, she was one of many silent voices that made sure those answers could not be avoided and that the previously effective evasions and deflections would no longer be sufficient. Take a deep breath. No matter how experienced a legal team is, there is a particular type of damage that cannot be handled by any PR firm. It is the result of 1,000 tiny discoveries. On its own, each one is trivial. Together, they create a story that the public is unable to ignore, despite each one appearing unimportant on its own. It tells the tale of the teddy bears on his bed that are organized in particular hierarchies. It tells the tale of the arguments over where to put the curtains or how hot the water is. It is the tale of a man who, although his own life was simultaneously deteriorating into public disrepute, and his associations and choices were being closely examined and found wanting, required complete perfection from everyone around him and considered those in his service as extensions of his will. On its own, each tale may have been written off as a small scandal or the harmless eccentricity of an elderly guy, but taken as a whole, they painted an unquestionably harmful picture, a picture of a man who was utterly disconnected from the environment he lived in and who saw himself as the ruler of a world that had long since vanished. The carefully controlled silence started to break when the maid decided to talk, which was the first crack in the dam. Everyone is burdened by the stillness after one person breaks it, become a burden for them and something they are unable to defend. Other voices started to come forth, the realization that the prince's power was not what it seemed to be, that it was a hollow shell that could be penetrated, and that his control was considerably more brittle than he thought had empowered other former employees who had suffered similar abuse. They began to talk about their personal encounters and tales of brutality and contempt of demands that verged on absurdity of a guy who appeared to be losing touch with reality. In front of the public, the reputation he had spent decades building, the meticulously preserved image of the war hero, the Queen's favorite son, the honorable royal figure, started to crumble. It was not overthrown by a single explosive document, nor was it overthrown by a single spectacular disclosure or abrupt confession. Rather, it was gradually and steadily undermined by the individuals he had ignored and disregarded for years, by the unseen people who had at last come to light, who had finally asserted their voice and refused to remain silent. Months after the hallway incident, the prince was sitting by himself in his royal lodge study one afternoon. In a way that seemed purposeful and controlled, the home was quieter now than it had been before. The number of employees moving through the hallways was lower. The attorneys were still there, but their faces had changed from somber to really defeated. The expression of those who realized the struggle was lost and had run out of arguments. He was hit with a terrible realization as he peered out the window at the high hedges, the well-kept lawns, and the gardens that encircled Royal Lodge. He remained a prince, he continued to live in a palace and to hold the status that had defined his whole life. However, there was a fundamental difference in the walls around him. They no longer seemed like a citadel that would shield him from the wrath of the outside world. Instead of feeling privileged, they felt imprisoned in a cage. He had always thought that his birthright, prestige, and place in the power structure would shield him from the repercussions that common people had to deal with. He had thought that the distinction was a reflection of his own intrinsic value, something that was eternal and unalterable, woven into the very structure of the planet. The basic reality that he was about to discover by painful experience was something he never grasped. Others had chosen to be different freely and out of obligation, habit, or resignation. However, it was a decision that may be changed at any time. The woman in the corridor did not cross his mind. If she had entered the room at that precise moment, he most likely would not have recognized her, would have viewed her as he always has, focusing exclusively on the role she played rather than the person she was. He still saw her as nothing more than a ghost who had failed in her career. An unseen person whose importance vanished as soon as she was no longer needed. She wasn't a ghost, though. She was the one who had witnessed the discrepancy between his public persona and his private life, who had chosen to speak and refused to remain silent in order to regain the dignity he had attempted to deprive her of. Now that she was working somewhere else, distant from Royal Lodge, she didn't have to worry about the exact temperature of tea, the hierarchy of teddy bears, or the feelings of a guy whose power was eroding. Her life may have been smaller in scope, less opulent, and less encircled by the trappings of wealth and power, but it was much greater in dignity and richer in the respect she was accorded by those around her. When she occasionally saw him on the news, she noticed how he appeared during that notorious interview, how his eyes darted frantically across the screen, how he fought to find the perfect words to explain himself, and how he seemed genuinely perplexed that people weren't. His explanations were being questioned rather than taken at face value, and his vision of reality was no longer being accepted. Her countenance would remain neutral as she observed a man losing his strength in real time for a brief period of time. After then, she would shut off the TV and carry on with her life, quietly aware that she had contributed to something greater than herself. Being the one who sees what is not supposed to be seen, the one who knows the secret has a subtle power. There is. Being the one to determine when that secret is no longer worth keeping gives you even more power. When the cost of speaking is outweighed by the weight of quiet. The prince believed he was imparting a lesson to her about her role in the world. Had thought that by making her cry and humiliating her in public, he was proving the hierarchy that controlled their relationship and establishing his power. He was never able to comprehend the underlying truth of the world he lived in, the danger that resulted from his treatment of people around him. Treating someone who sees you at your worst, who observes your shortcomings, your cruelty, and your failures when you think no one is looking, as if they don't exist at all, as if they are not a real person with agency, will, and the ability to make decisions, is risky. Prince Andrew's reputation did not perish in a courtroom, in the corridors of Parliament, or in the bureaucratic chambers. It perished in the corridors of. In the rooms where he had thought he was completely protected, his own house collapsed. He overlooked a fundamental aspect of human nature, which is why it perished. A ghost has a voice too. Everyone stops to listen when a ghost breaches the magic of invisibility and begins to talk. Royal Lodge stood as it always has, looking from the outside like a stronghold of unwavering tradition, a monument to continuity and custom, as the sun sank over the property, creating long, skeletal shadows across the grass. Privilege. The air was different inside, though. Fundamentally and permanently altered. The reverent calm of a home serving its occupant was no longer the silence that pervaded the hallways. It was the quiet of a vacant room, the quiet of absence, the quiet of something vital being taken away. The man who resided there was still encircled by history, his birthright's tangible possessions and the title in the lands and the locations. However, he was by himself. The unseen people had vanished, taking his image with them. They had removed the well-kept facade, exposing what was underneath. Now the hallway was deserted. Nobody was standing there with shaking hands and a silver tray. Nobody was standing there with tears streaming down their faces and trembling shoulders. The only sound in the room was the wind rattling the window frames, the marble was chilly and the light was low. He had desired a ghostly home, a location where individuals merely existed to serve him, where they made no claims, filed no complaints, and just vanished when they were no longer required. And that is just what he received in the end. However, the ghosts he received were not the submissive, unseen helpers he had envisioned. They were the ghosts of his own reputation, reminding him that the authority he had taken for granted was never truly his. They haunted him with every story and revelation.